creative energy uncovering what it was that made me different. When I went to high school, this started to change a little bit because I was able to develop a vocabulary. I started to see what it was that made me different than other people because, as we all know, hormones kick in, and we sort of can say, so that's the problem. Now, when I went to high school, I was introduced to the director of the debate team, Jonathan Cruz, who was the first gay person I had ever met who owned their identity unapologetically. Instead of expending his creative energy to change himself and to cover and to meet the standards that society wanted him to meet, he instead put his energy into building a community of dedicated students who worshiped him because he was a debate god. The hilarious thing is, and I didn't put up a photo because he would hate me, is, he was a slightly overweight Jewish man from Great Neck who had a following. How does that happen? And it's because he used his energy, he didn't apologize for himself. By not having to cover, he was able to apply that energy into a community and into students. But that wasn't quite yet enough for me to own my own identity. I had to start working at a meth lab. Now, clarification. You thought this TED Talk was going in another direction. By meth lab, I mean it was a research lab where I studied people addicted to meth. This is what it looked like. It was not a trailer in Albuquerque, I promise. Yeah, it was 726 Broadway. Very, very different than Albuquerque, so I've heard. So it was at this laboratory that I met another mentor. You see, at Bronx Science, the seniors and other students engage in these research projects where they email professors all around the country and try to get them to help them with research projects, and we can submit these papers to all of these things across the country, yada, yada, yada. And the only professor who responded to me happened to be one that I reached out to just because he held a prestigious position at NYU Steinhardt. His name was Perry Halkides. And Perry Halkides was yet another example of a man who was owning his identity, but also we had a lot in common that I didn't realize. He had grown up in the neighborhood that I had went to school and that my mother was from, Astoria, Queens, which will explain my parents' accent if you have met them, and my own if it slips out. But also he had gone to the Bronx High School of Science. And meeting another person who had used his creative energy into building a community around him, to building a laboratory around him, made me feel comfortable at least owning my identity to myself. But it yet really wasn't enough for me to start owning it to other people. I needed a more powerful force. I needed to understand what the history of this community looked like. So the first thing that I had learned was the reality of my own identity was that I couldn't cover. And understanding who I was to myself, at the very least, allowed me to be happy for the first time in years. When it came to showing other people, I was in luck. You see, this lab was only 2 blocks away from this building. Now, some of you may not recognize this building, and if you do, my phone number is on the program. I'm joking. But for those of you who don't recognize this building, let me give you some historic context. This building was the Stonewall Inn, and it was a short walk from where I was working. And I passed this building nearly a dozen times before I finally realized that I was working only 2 or 3 blocks away from the birth of the gay rights movement. And this was important for one real reason. Because Stonewall was one of the first instances in American history where the LGBTQ community said, we will not try to hide anymore. We are tired of using our energies to cover. We would rather own ourselves and use our identities to change the systems around us. It was there the first time that they acknowledged it is easier to change a community, it is easier to change a society than to change your own identity. And it does much less damage that way. And it was those who could not change their identity. It was those who had the most trouble covering. The drag queens, the effeminate gay men, the queer women, who were the ones to throw the first bricks, the first rocks, the first punches. Being exposed to this history gave me the strength and knowledge that I was joining a community. I was not the first. I had the shoulders of giants to stand on. Not just Perry Halkides, not just John Cruz, but also an entire movement. This influenced the rest of my high school career, where I sort of vowed to be outrageous. There were administrators who were homophobic and who gave pushback during a project defense of the research that I was doing. An administrator who had known that I was gay publicly questioned me and said, well, you're only studying gay men and sexual behaviors because you're going to get the results that you want. Every gay man has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sexual partners, and they're just born to make bad decisions. Now, first of all, I was disappointed to learn that all gay men had hundreds and hundreds of sexual partners. I had not experienced that. But A dozen would have been nice. But dealing with this pushback required one more understanding. Why would I fight? Why would I engage in this work? Why would I fight? Why would I be out? And even if I had all this history, what good was that? What good was it doing if I could still hide away? Right? I had this ability. Why fight it? But it was in the work that I was doing at the lab that taught me something else. You see, my research revolved around men who became exposed to HIV/AIDS in the context of drug use. And the vast majority of the men that I studied were men of color. They also were very unlikely to identify as gay, even though their behaviors were almost exclusively, all of their sexual behaviors were almost exclusively with men. And this was interesting. Because they were less likely to identify as gay, they were less likely to seek out community resources. They were less likely to identify with testing resources. The fact that the modern gay rights movement at the time had ignored communities of color and been focused on being mainstream, were just like you. Look at Ellen. She's not going to try to convert you. She's on daytime television, right? And we had left out the more radical elements of our communities, those who have a harder time fitting in. These communities were left behind. They had no one to go to for resources, and this was having real health implications. And to this day, the rate of HIV infection in the United States among young men of color is increasing. And if it increases at current rates, it is